This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second of our 5 Stanford Summer Science Lecture Series under the stars. Not quite yet. My name is Channing Robertson, and I'm a Stanford Chemical Engineering professor, and in my downtime, I serve as Senior Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs in the School of Engineering. And as with many of you, I'm joined by my family. My wife, Donna, who's Director of Donor Relations at Stanford, and that's donor as in money. My daughter, Jody, she's an ER physician, so if you get indigestion or overcome by the talk, go see her. And our first grandkid, Miss Finley, who are all sitting back here on a blanket. So this program is in some sense an extension of our Brainstorms series that runs during the academic year. There we feature 3 speakers, 1 each quarter, and I invite you to keep your eyes and ears open for next year's venue as we bring you Stanford's brightest and best across all fields of science and technology. Now my good friend and colleague, Pat Devaney, where are you, Pat? Somewhere wandering around? Right here, sitting down here, and her staff, Marnie Goldman and Judy McCune, who comprise Stanford's Office of Science Outreach, ably orchestrate these programs. And with the terrific support of our Dean of Research, Artie Bienenstock, these folks work tirelessly to develop and deliver organized activities targeted at our community's youth, school teachers, and all the rest of us who make up the remaining public, in hope of increasing everyone's interest, awareness, understanding, and involvement in math, science, and engineering. Now, as I said, this is the second one. Our first one was Steve Palumbi, who talked about the rebirth of the Monterey Coast. And to mark your calendars, 2 weeks from today, on July 20th, we'll be hearing from Mark Zoback, his wife, Mary Lou Zoback, talking about earthquakes. Now, let's get away with a few ground rules. You may continue to eat and drink. You may lie down. You may gaze at the stars. And you may sleep. And if you do, tonight's talk will be available on Stanford's iTunes in about 1 week. And Steve Palumbi's talk is available on iTunes. By the way, you may not snore. And you may not use your cell phone or BlackBerry or Blueberry or any other kind of berry or any other form of knowledge transfer apparatus powered by batteries, fuel cells, wind, solar, coal, natural gas, propane, or wind up. And if you do not know how to turn off your device, pour your drink on it. Also beware, we are under the flight path of Stanford's Life Flight helicopter. When and if it decides to land or take off, we will suspend our discourse, catch our collective breath and wits, and let it pass. Please do not become angry and shine your laser pointer at it. This is a felony associated with a 15-year sentence to Berkeley. So having said that, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, my good friend and colleague, Matt Scott. In doing these sorts of things, I take a morbid curiosity in Googling people and then seeing what is said about them on the 75th page of the Google citation. Now, usually the stuff before the 75th page is much less interesting. This is due to the page ranking system used by Google. You see, the material up front is there because the person being Googled spends a great deal of time each day Googling their own favorite personal items so they get placed ahead of others, thereby corrupting the ordering and creating false bias. Now, I know Matt would not do this, although I must confess that based on my deep investigation, there is strong indication of self-manipulation at work. First, one finds certain false information, such as a Matthew Scott, who was born in Longreach, Queensland, and plays for the North Queensland Cowboys, and was born on July 30th, 1985. Clearly, by looking at Matt, we know the birth date is incorrect. As for the other stuff, well, who knows? Next, we find that Matthew Scott, if I have the right one, attended an institute in Massachusetts as opposed to a university, where he received both his BS and PhD degrees, after which he took a postdoctoral position at Indiana University. Google Maps confirmed that it is in Indiana. He acquired his first faculty position at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and there he sat for 7 years. During that time, he was appointed a Howard Hughes medical investigator, a much better deal than being appointed a dean, I will assure you. But once the ski lift tickets became too expensive, he decided to depart Colorado and go west to Stanford to join the faculty of the Department of Developmental Biology in the medical school. He served a mercifully short 3-year period as chair of the department, but was later coaxed into taking the helm of the BioX Leadership Council, the group that oversees our spectacular new interdisciplinary biosciences facility just across the street from here to your right. As you know, this is an exciting intellectual sandbox for close to 40 faculty and hundreds of students who come from such diverse fields as medicine, biology, the physical sciences, engineering, and the social sciences, and even business and law. Now, referring to Matt's interests, I thought I had hit on some real pay dirt when I started turning up Google hits that matched Matt with hedgehogs. At first, I thought this might be something private that I shouldn't reveal in public. Indeed, Matt lives down the street from me, and I've seen him walking a rather strange creature early in the morning. I just thought it was an experiment in progress. But after searching a bit further, I found that the term hedgehog referred to a signaling system discovered in fruit flies and named after the bristly, stubbly, crust-like appearance of certain mutant flies. Bon appetit for those of you that are still eating. May your fly swatter be effective against the mutant attack. This signaling system is used in most animals to control development of numerous tissues, and in humans, those include the spinal cord, limbs, skeleton, and skin. And so it is that Matt gets his kicks out of figuring out how embryonic and later development is governed by proteins that control gene activity and signaling important messages that modulate developmental cycles. Phew, I got that out. Hopefully at the end of the evening, we'll know what on earth was up with the gopher in Caddyshack, why Mickey Mouse only has 4 fingers, and why Chihuahuas are genetic dead ends. And so, let's hear about the unraveling of the mysteries of the human body, or in English, why we get so depressed when we look in the mirror. My good friend, Matt Scott.
Well, it's clearly completely hopeless to follow that in any way. Some of what he said was true. I was a cowboy. I was in Boulder. I was in Boulder last week as well, and it's still just as beautiful. All right, so we're here to talk about evolution, and I'm really gratified to see this level of interest. I'm honored to be with you. Thanks for coming. This is pretty exciting. Evolution has been so much in the news for all the wrong reasons that I hope tonight we can concentrate on the right reasons and talk about why it's fun and why it's useful. And in my case, how it's been an excuse to go to some of the most beautiful places in the world. So I suggest that whether you like it or don't like it, you at least use it for all it's worth. You can go to the Galapagos, you could go to beautiful places in the Canadian Rockies, you can go to all sorts of fossil beds in gorgeous places just to see all the evidence for this process. And it's a great excuse. My daughter, who's sitting over here, has been to a number of those places, and she can tell you that she's not that excited about that part of the science, but she had a great time there. All right, so evolution is useful. Evolution is going on around us all the time. It's the basis for the resistance to drugs of disease organisms. It's the basis for changing viruses that infect us. It has immense medical importance, and it's the fundamental principle for all of biology. I'm not biased or anything. That's a balanced, even-handed description of the truth. It is, in fact, what keeps us going in the lab. And I'd like to right away say I'm a developmental geneticist. I study how genes control the growth of organisms. That's my specialty. I'm not a paleontologist. I'm not a statistician. I'm not a whole bunch of things. And I look around here and I see some world experts in all sorts of areas relevant to this talk. By all means, interrupt, correct me, speak up, and try to be as funny as Channing. Okay, so here we are, and we're going to start, I think, with sitting, as I got to do a couple of years ago, staring into the eyes of a mountain gorilla in Bwindi impenetrable forest, it's called. Bwindi is a national forest, but it's also an impenetrable forest. And I was visiting there, it's in Uganda, and I was visiting there. We got to go out in the woods and track them down and sit with them for an hour on each of 3 days. I cannot possibly do this justice. It's an incredible experience, and if some of you may have had it, but if you haven't, think about it because it's a remarkable thing. You're gazing across a 7 million year gap at one of our closest relatives, and they're looking back as they flip through the guidebook to humans to try to figure out what you're about and why you're there and what you want and whether you're good for anything. And of course, you're quite helpless in that situation. They would never attack you, but in the sense that you don't know what you're doing, and they know 40 species of plants that are edible. It's an amazing experience watching the babies and seeing in them all of the things you see in those girls, all the activities and the competition and everything going on that looks so much like something you recognize. And unlike, say, zebras, which all look kind of the same to us, all the gorillas have individual faces that instantly take on a personality and character as we as humans look at them. There are only 400 or so of these animals left on the face of the earth. There are none in zoos. They are on the brink of extinction. Anything you can do in the way of tourism will probably help prevent the last killing off of this incredibly interesting species that in the future will undoubtedly give us much greater insights into ourselves, even if you don't want to attach their own value for their own sake. So that's one evolutionary experience of a sort. And another poignant one is visiting the Galapagos and sitting on the beach with a sea lion who couldn't care less about you, and you walk right up and shake hands, and you envision Darwin in 1835 sitting on the same beach looking at the same animals. He was only there for a month. This is the most famous piece of his voyage with the Beagle. He was there for 1 month, and the main word he used to describe this magical place was hideous. He described it over and over as hideous. Twice in the same paragraph, he said it was hideous. He thought the lizards were disgusting, the iguanas. He went on and on about what an awful, sort of desolate place it is. And indeed, that's a fair description, except now we get to go there in comfortable boats. His boat was not so comfortable. Let's talk about his trip, because his trip was a world-changing event, not just for him, but for all of us. So he was born in 1809, and he set off at the age of 22 for what was supposed to be a 2-year voyage, but turned into a 5-year voyage around the world with many stops, a magical experience for anyone. His captain, Fitzroy, Robert Fitzroy, much his senior, was 27 years old when they left Portsmouth, England, and this was the senior guy. So Darwin had some doubts about the whole thing. First of all, the boat. The boat was made to go along the coast. It was 90 feet long, which would be a barely respectable yacht for a small number of people in these days, but it held 73 men. It was 24 feet wide. The cabin in which Darwin ended up living for 5 years was 10 by 11 feet, but he didn't live alone in there. He had the whole ship's library and a roommate in there, and his specimens were being stuffed into every possible nook and cranny. He brought back thousands of specimens. He also couldn't stand up in there because he was about 6 feet tall and the cabin was not. So this is not easy traveling compared to what we're used to now. Fitzroy was a brilliant navigator and seaman who later was one of the first to develop the barometer as a useful tool in predicting the weather. And although he wasn't using that at the time of this voyage, he did later save many lives by his recognition of the usefulness of that tool. And he's responsible for having mapped a lot of the west coast of South America and some other areas as well. Now, he had been on an earlier voyage where 3 people from Tierra del Fuego were more or less kidnapped, actually 4, one died later, and they had to return these people. So the voyage had a couple of objectives. One was mapping, another was bringing these people home, which had been promised, and the other was general adventure, because these were a bunch of young guys who didn't want to sit around in grimy old England in the rain. They wanted to go to tropics and see beautiful places, and they didn't know about the diseases they were going to get. Now, things didn't start off too well. A sailor fell overboard and drowned before they even left the port. And this could not have made Darwin, who had never been on a boat, very excited about the prospects. They finally left in a lovely time of year, December 10th, 1831, and there was a gale. Darwin was incredibly seasick. In fact, he spent most of the 5 years, the parts of it on the boat, being seasick. He never really adapted, and he came home and continued to be sick on and off for most of his life. It had a lasting impact. Anyway, there was a gale. He got sick. They went back to port and gave up because they couldn't get out. They left again on December 21st, full of vim and vigor, ready to go again, and they ran aground. They got stuck, and the way they got the boat off the reef was the crew ran back and forth from side to rock it off the reef. This is actually true. And they went back to port because there was another gale. And finally, on December 27th, they actually made it out of the harbor. This is not an auspicious beginning to go around the world and explore, but you know, it was quite an adventure. And remember, Darwin was only 22, so at that age, you're up for a lot of adversity, at least for a little while. That said, after this voyage, he never left his house again, basically, but that's true, but he had quite a voyage. So their first exciting stop for him was the Cape Verde Islands, about 300 miles off the west coast of Africa. And one of the things that he noted down in his diary that he saw there that puzzled him a little bit, and this was a guy who had grown up as a naturalist. He collected beetles. He did all sorts of things playing around in the outdoors instead of doing what he was supposed to be doing, which was studying medicine. He didn't like the sight of blood. It made him sick. He didn't want to be a doctor. His father wanted to be a doctor. He had doctors in the family and so on. And later he was supposed to enter the ministry. What he actually really liked was collecting beetles. So he was a person who turns over rocks and looks at things with great curiosity. And this, in fact, was the beginning of an adventure that encompasses all of us now. So what he noticed on these islands was a band of whitish stripe in the rocks. And it was about 30 feet above sea level. And when he looked at what was making it so white, it was all seashells. How'd they get up there? Who put them there? What's going on? Why isn't it at sea level or below sea level where it belongs? So this kind of thing was the first in a long series of things that puzzled him and bothered him that he saw. And being on a voyage where he had mostly rough seamen with him and a couple of gentlemen, most particularly the captain, to talk to about ideas, he was free to think any old way he wanted. The kind of freedom we try to build into our science now for our students. Here, we try to encourage our students to challenge their faculty and point out how wrong they are all the time. This is the best thing that can be done with students. And in fact, the easiest way to make that happen is for us as faculty to say things that are wrong all the time, which we do regularly, intentionally or not. Now, took along as reading material a couple of books that he really consulted a lot. One was Charles Lyell's newly published Principles of Geology, a pretty fantastic revolutionary book for its time. Another was the Bible, and then there was a ship's library with quite a few other reference books and so on. Lyell's subtitle was An Attempt to Explain the Former Changes of the Earth's Surface by Reference to Causes Now in Operation. as you look around at geology, you see evidence for tumultuous explosions and dramatic changes in the landscape, old volcanoes and earthquakes and so on. But there was, of course, the idea that something maybe very dramatic had happened, or a series of such things had happened to shape the landscape. Lyell was making the counter-argument that, in fact, most of what you saw you could explain by processes you could observe going on around you if you paid attention. So the idea that more subtle events, not such huge upset sort of events, could add up to very dramatic changes, like, for example, mountains rising, was an idea of gradualism that was not the prevalent idea, and Darwin was letting this soak in between bouts of seasickness. In thinking about his seashells 30 feet above the sea level, he was thinking, how did they get there? And was that a sudden rise? Did the sea go down? Did the land go up? What happened? He thought the land probably went up. Lyell, in his book, also posed a question that Darwin did not at the time try to answer, but Lyell did, and that was the question whether, as the land changed, the animals and plants had changed with it. And Lyell said no. He said the changes would kill off animals that found themselves in inappropriate environments, climates, locations, getting drowned, whatever, that they did not change. Now, they crossed the equator. Darwin was thrown into the water to celebrate. They went to Brazil, and he had one of his dreams fulfilled there, which was to visit the tropics. He had dreamed of going to the tropics. This was one of the reasons a number of people in the crew had embarked on this voyage. The exotic, warm, rainy forests, the incredible flowers, the exotic animals, the deadly diseases, all the charms of a foreign place. And they found them first, really, stopping in Brazil. Now, he was still collecting. I mean, he'd been collecting much of his life, but now he was collecting at a different scale, and he was looking for all sorts of things, both living and dead. And among the dead things he was looking for were fossils, of course, and he found some pretty amazing fossils in October of that year, so this 1832, and these are what is now called Megatherium. These were giant ground sloths, which are extinct and were extinct. But they were huge and impressive, and he started to send bones back to England. And it was his shipments of fossils and specimens all through the voyage. Every time they met up with a boat headed back to England, they'd send along some boxes. And this ended up making him very famous because his friends back there put them on display, and they were the wonders of the scientific community and even reached public significance. Now, they reached Tierra del Fuego and there tried to maintain some sort of relations with the people. There was a very, very hard existence there. The people were sort of desperate, on the edge of survival, really, and it caused all sorts of thoughts to go through his head, that some of which we would now call the issues about racism, and were these the same species really, and things like this. He was in fact quite enlightened in our modern view about this, and had a fierce argument with Fitzroy about slavery at one point that almost ended the voyage as a team effort. So they returned the 3 people they'd brought with them to their home, to the, quote, savages, unquote, that they encountered there, and went around Cape Horn. And then, of course, as is typical for all you Patrick O'Brien fans, they found a huge storm waiting for them and were blown back and forth. By the way, for those of you who love those books as I do, Stephen Maturin is, at least in part, Darwin, and he's also partly Joseph Banks. So the waves got huge. There was a series of 3 waves at one point that put one of the rails 3 feet under the water, and they thought they were going to lose the ship. This was terrifying. Remember, this was a land lubber, very seasick guy. But they got through. They got to the Falkland Islands, which had just been taken over by England, even though there was actually only 1 Englishman living on them. And he found fossils there. He went hunting and shot lots of birds that he mounted as skins and sent back to England. He did a lot of horseback riding, which he'd been pretty good at back home. But they went back around. They went back to Brazil, and they spent a long time on the other coast exploring. He found some very interesting fossils. He found a skeleton of a horse-sized creature which had a long, small head like an anteater. It was clear to him from these experiences that there were all sorts of animal bones around that were not obviously represented by any living animal, that a huge number of species had died out for one reason or another. And this was a formative realization for him. So they went back around the Horn. They visited Chile. They went for rides and hikes and took mules up into the mountains. They visited various spots along the Andes. In Chile, he found seashells not at 30 feet above sea level, but at 1,300 feet above sea level. This was pretty disturbing to him because that's really far up, and there they were. And then another great moment in his experience there, he experienced a really serious earthquake that lasted for 2 minutes, and the land near him rose 3 feet. Even better than any one we've had here. So your competitive juices should be flowing. However, this was an incredible moment because it showed him right there how those seashells had got up there. You didn't have to postulate a whole lot of those, only 10 of those for the 30-footer, and then quite a few for the 1,300. But you know, it was clear that this was a very dramatic thing. At another point in the trip, he saw a volcano going through an enormous eruption. And this really brought home to this impressionable young guy the forces of nature, how much things change, how much the land is affected, and how much potentially the plants and animals on the land will be affected. Okay, so they climbed into the Andes at an altitude of 7,000 feet. They saw a petrified forest, 50 fossilized trees that had presumably been buried deep, deep down under thousands of feet of silt, providing the pressure to turn them into crystal rock, and then lifted up again and stripped away. They'd been covered by lava, it was clear from looking at the rocks, and they'd been lifted way up into the Andes, 7,000 feet. So again, confronted with a kind of reality that did not accord well with most of the then prevalent beliefs about where land moved, whether it stayed put, whether things were stable or not. And then he topped everything by seeing at 13,000 feet fossil seashells, tenfold more. So it's getting worse and worse. And he saw this, he held these, he couldn't deal with this, right? He's confronted with a reality that's very hard to fit into some of the old ideas. Now in September, of 1835, he spent a month on the Galapagos, only a month, not much. He hated it, you know. But he did see these amazing things like lizards that would swim in salt water, which is a really startling concept. They don't do that other places. Now, he's famous, of course, for noticing that in an archipelago like that, where you have islands separated, even though the islands have very similar land masses, they're not identical. Some are much younger than others, and some of them have fresh lava all over them, and other ones have worn down, and so the volcanoes have eroded down to sea level, and there's more soil and more plants as a result. But they're pretty similar, and parts of them were similar to some of the other islands he'd been to. And yet, as he went from island to island, there were differences between the animals, more or less the same animals, but only more or less. They weren't the same. Why weren't they the same? The same kind of land, same kind of place. Why bother painting them different colors? And yet they were not the same. Now this is what he's famous for. This is the legend, and it's partly true. He noticed, for instance, that the mockingbirds, which are very friendly and cheerful on these islands, always sort of being pests, would come up, and he'd noticed they were different from island to island in 3 different versions. But he missed the finches. Remember, all of you know that Darwin's finches, this is the most famous thing, you know. The finches are all different. Excuse me. Sorry, I have dog evolution props here, and they're noticing other dogs. Your turn will come later. So he missed the finches. He didn't, in fact, label his finch specimens to indicate, oh, it's that one. Okay, this is a great, everyone should look at that dog over there because it's a perfect example of the difference between dogs over evolutionary time. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. I didn't stage this. This couldn't have been better. Now I need a dachshund to walk by. Okay, and a greyhound and a mastiff, and we'll be all set. Okay, so the finches he missed. So they were different. They were different within an island and between islands. They had different beak forms, shapes, food, and so on. And in retrospect, the way we'd view it now is that these finches found themselves, when they came from the mainland, their ancestors came from the mainland, they found themselves in a place where there weren't a lot of other birds, and most of the available evolutionary niches were not filled. There was all sorts of stuff to eat for lots of different kinds of birds, niches that would be filled normally by all kinds of different birds, but instead there was just the finches, and they radiated. They started to change. Now we're jumping way ahead in the story here, but they started to change to take advantage of all this. And some have today big, heavy beaks for eating big nuts, and others have little fine beaks for catching small insects and so on. There are even vampire finches, which this is going in and out, which live off blood, pecking the backs of seabirds to get blood. So they have acquired all sorts of differences within a family that would normally be far more ordinary and uniform. But here they didn't have any competition. They spread out and started doing all sorts of things. Anyway, he missed most of this, and it was only much later back in England when he started trying to sort it out. He realized he'd blundered, and he started getting help from Fitzroy himself, from some of the other scientists, from some of the seamen, in fact, who had shot birds and so on, to sort of sort it out. And eventually he did sort it out and realized there was a lot of important information there. Now the tortoises, the giant tortoises, which are so famous, also differ from island to island very dramatically. Some of them have a big saddle-like shape to the front of the shells, and others are just smoothly rounded. It hits you right in the face when you see these things. It's a really striking difference. He did notice the differences, but didn't realize that it was island-specific. Since the ships used tortoises as food, they did things I consider very cruel, like take the tortoises in the hold of the ship and flip them over and leave them there for months, and they'd stay alive, and they'd use them as food. This was a common practice of the day, and to me quite horrifying. But these are, of course, ancient animals. In fact, some of the animals I met when I was in the Galapagos might have been there when Darwin was there, which is a sort of astonishing thing to think about. In any case, the tortoises that had been put in the ships had been recorded, where they were picked up, which dates they'd been picked up, and so on. So there was some record of which ones had come from which island. So again, it was possible to reconstruct where they'd come from and what was going on. And indeed, there was a vice governor. There was a prison camp on one of the islands. There was a vice governor there who said he could recognize from the shape of a tortoise, the appearance of a tortoise, what island it had come from. So there were people even pointing this out to Darwin and to the others. Darwin's comment on these islands, these amazing islands at the equator, I quote, "so totally useless to man or the larger animals." This is they're now a paradise and an amazing place to visit. They are, as you probably know, at the convergence of cold and warm currents. So you see fur seals and penguins in the same place. You see tropical birds and flamingos and so on. And the mix is simply astounding. Plus, none of them are afraid of you. So you can walk right up to them. It's a Garden of Eden feeling that is astounding. So what he said, the scientific impact of this was very real, and here's a quote from Darwin. "When I see these islands in sight of each other and possessed of but a scanty stock of animals, tenanted by these birds but slightly differing in structure and filling the same place in nature, I must suspect they are only varieties. If there is the slightest foundation for these remarks, the zoology of archipelagos will be well worth examining, for such facts would undermine the stability of species." He wrote that much later, but you can see where it came from. All along the way, he was confronted with strange animals. In the Galapagos, there are flightless cormorants with little stubby vestigial wings. Why have stubby vestigial wings in an animal that was designed for the purpose? It doesn't help them. They're losing them. why not just have an animal that's just great for swimming, which is what they need to do. There are no predators that chase them on land. They could swim away from barracuda faster if they had something better adapted to underwater. He saw blind cave creatures with vestigial eyes. Well, why have vestigial eyes if you're a blind cave creature? Wouldn't you be just fine with none whatsoever, and so on? Okay, so these were puzzles that were confronting him all the time. Okay, so November 1835, they set off and went 1,000 miles a week to get to Tahiti. Now, that was an island he didn't complain one bit about. He was perfectly happy with Tahiti and didn't learn much there, but had a great time. There were a few quiet comments about the natives, but not as many as you read about in Mutiny on the Bounty. Then New Zealand, Australia, the Indian Ocean. Just imagine what impact this had on, by then, a 23, 4-year-old young man. And Cape of Good Hope in May 1836, and then home to England in October 1836 after 5 years of the greatest adventure one could imagine, with, in his case, showing his sort of sense of duty and seriousness of purpose, aside from cases and cases and cases of stuff he'd already sent home. He came home with 1,529 species pickled in alcohol and 3,907 skins and bones and other preserved specimens. He was 27 years old. He was already famous as one of the great naturalists from what he had sent ahead, and he was welcomed home, and he was worried because he had these revolutionary ideas. And here was his career going great, and he knew if he opened his mouth and said species aren't stable, let alone people might have evolved from something like an ape, this would be the end of this promising career. And indeed, it was another 20 years before he published his ideas. And he worked very hard for those 20 years. In between his other, what seems to be major activity, he had 10 children during that time. And you have to say that Emma, his wife, is the one who deserves the great credit there, because she did most of the care of them. Now, of those 10 children, 3 died as children. One of them, someone he was very, very close to, was just devastating, his daughter Annie. And so he was seeing some of the process of lack of survival that he'd been observing in the animals, you know, a kind of deadly selection. In 1838, a couple of years later, he read this new book that was all the rage by Malthus, who talked about the struggle for existence and overpopulation. And Darwin said, "It had once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed." He wrote that in his autobiography, published in 1876, many years later. But the point was that Malthus, the ideas of Malthus, that human overpopulation meant there had to be a struggle for survival, was perfectly applicable to these other situations involving animals or plants or whatever. And so all of this was near perfect training, as far as one can tell now, for being open-minded, for challenging dogma, because there was no one on the ship to argue with him, and for getting a richness of experience that set the stage for his later revolutionary work. But he wasn't the first in his family to be thinking like this. He had an outrageous grandfather who was sort of scandalous and wild. His name was Erasmus, which is fitting. And 1802, he died, the grandfather died in 1802, but he'd written a poem about something he called transmutation. Now this is 2 generations earlier, right? He wrote, "Organic life beneath the shoreless waves was born and nursed in ocean's pearly caves. First forms minute, unseen by spheric glass, move on the mud or pierce the watery mass. Then as successive generations bloom, new powers acquire and larger limbs assume." It's the whole thing. So what do we even need Charles for? We had Erasmus, right? But he hadn't worked out all the details, and he had no data. Charles had the data and collected lots more. Okay, so let's talk about the influences then. This is a guy who's growing up in farm country, so he's looking around him and he's seeing a process that is commonly even now described as artificial selection. I don't actually like that phrase because it's not artificial, it's real selection, it's just that people happen to do it. And the key point here, of course, is, and this is where we get to the dogs, is that if you decide to make some decisions about who lives or who doesn't, or who is bred and who isn't bred, you hear that, guys? Then you will have a tremendous impact over a rather short time on the properties of organisms. And what were this specific? So he had a friend named Orford who bred greyhounds for racing. He increased his greyhound stamina by picking out the finest of each litter and crossing them. That works. It's sort of amazing that that works. Our glorious founder, Stanford, as you know, did the same thing with racehorses over there. And it worked, even though nobody really understood why it worked. All right. Another person, Sir John Seabright, shared what became a passion with Darwin, which was pigeon fancy. Now, do we have any pigeon fanciers? I got to be careful who I insult. Pigeon fancy was all the rage, and this, in fact, Darwin is a member of 2 London clubs that did this sort of thing. Pigeons have all come from our, you know them, the rock dove, to give it their distinguished and undeserved title. And so one wild species, basically. But if you start messing with them and selecting the weird ones, you can get some really strange-looking pigeons, all kinds of colors and feathers all over the place and funny faces and shapes. It was easy to do this. There were clubs devoted to doing this. You've seen probably a lot of weird chickens in your time too. Same thing's been done with chickens now, but this was a big deal. And Sir John Seabright, one of his friends, boasted that he could produce any feather in 3 years and any form in 6. These people were sensing the power of selection and breeding and seeing what impact this could have. And this is, you know, if it can happen artificially in this way, then why not naturally? So, and Seabright wrote, so this is hitting home for Darwin, a severe winter or a scarcity of food by destroying the weak and the unhealthy has had all the good effects of the most skillful selection. In cold and barren countries, no animal can live to the age of maturity, but those who have strong constitutions, the weak and the unhealthy, do not live to propagate their infirmities. So again, right in your face, there it is, all right? So, dogs. These guys were the first domesticated animal, judging from the fossil record. Some of you may wonder about cats. As far as I can tell, cats have never been domesticated. They're marvelous animals, but they're not with us entirely. There are more than 1,000 varieties of dogs now around the world. Samoyeds like these, Newfoundlands, Dachshunds, Greyhounds, Chihuahuas, Terriers. They can vary 50-fold in weight. And now with a much better fossil record than Darwin had to work with, we can ask questions about how long did this take? Because one of the hardest things for any of us to deal with in thinking about evolution is the dramatic morphological changes that must have happened. It's almost beyond belief. You look at the differences in animals and say, how could that have happened over the amount of time there's been? And we're going to talk more about time in a moment. But for the dogs, we know. So they came from wolves, of course. There have been investigations of which wolves, and it appears that it's East Asian wolves. The first fossil that looks like a dog is 14,000 years old. And there are others from, those are from Germany, or that one is from Germany, and others from Israel are about 12,000 years old. They've looked at the DNA, comparing the DNA of lots of different kinds of dogs and wolves and so on, and classed them into different groups and so on. And it looks as though there was a single origin of domestic dogs about 15,000 years ago. And so if you think of a generation as 2 years, and you can pick whatever number you like, then we're talking about some 7,500 generations of breeding with selection by people of the kind they wanted for pulling sleds, guarding children, pointing, running down burrows to chase things, running very fast, eating up enemies, herding, and so on. Okay. In North America, there is evidence that they followed people or led people across the Bering Strait. Now it's interesting, that's always presented as the people were selecting dogs and everything. If you think about the survival conditions of the Bering Strait, it might have been the dogs choosing the people. And everyone in North America who's a native North American, which is not me, is descended from the people who came across the Bering Strait. So we may have been, or those ancestors may have been chosen by the dogs. Some of them were appealing people to bring along and others weren't. It's kind of fun to think about. Now, the DNA, has shown pretty clearly that's where they came from, and then they radiated in this country along with the people. There are now 50 million pedigreed dogs in the United States alone. They've all been, there's a long record of the crosses and so on. And so the dog genome was recently finished, and the prospect is actually for tracing the parts of the chromosomes that give dogs their different properties, because you have all the records. And the question is a fairly simple one. Which pieces of DNA do you have to have in a certain version to look like this versus a Pekingese, a Dachshund, a Chihuahua, a Mastiff? Okay, that's the kind of question that increasingly it will be possible to ask and maybe even answer if there are relatively few pieces of DNA that account for the effect. Because if there are little bits all over the genome, then it's very hard to trace the piece that matters, even with lots of pedigrees and lots of dogs. Okay, so we'll see if that works. Let's talk about plants a little bit, because I don't want to neglect plants. The cereals, which account for about half the calories in what we eat, were domesticated about 10,000 years ago. So we're talking about a similar time span, and indeed a rather similar number of generations, on the order of 10,000 generations. Maize here in North America, in Mexico, sorghum in Africa, rice in Africa and Asia, and wheat in the Near East. These things all came from plants that were not as well suited to our needs and were absolutely transformed. I was at Mesa Verde last week, looking in Colorado, and looking at the corn that those people were raising, which isn't very long ago, and there are these little corn stalks this long with much fewer lines of kernels and so on. But the original ones, the teosinte, that was probably the plant that was the source, almost certainly was the source of the original corn, had a single line of kernels, and each kernel was encased in a hard shell, and they fell off as individual seeds. So people selected strains that had lost that hard covering. It had actually opened up, and it multiplied vastly the number of rows of kernels and the number of kernels. So now we have these things you need a truck to carry around, never mind the zucchini. So these things are transformed by the selection process and in relatively recent time. Now we can talk about humans a little bit too, because we're all busy selecting humans to some degree. How many people here are wearing glasses? Quite a few. Yeah, I don't know how many of us would have been here in an older time. And so there are ways that I'd just like to point out that evolution can be defeated. Okay, so at least for a little while. So in 1859 then, in 1858 first, he published a paper together with Alfred Russel Wallace, who had been working in Borneo and elsewhere, and had come to many of the same conclusions about variation and selection and so on, but hadn't documented it as well as Darwin had in his 20 years of work and all his collecting and so on. But they published together. The paper was submitted by Charles Lyell, the geologist who'd written The Principles of Geology, and Lyell did not entirely buy everything Darwin said. He never thought natural selection was really a good idea, but he did support the publishing of these two papers. And then Darwin finally had to come forward with The Origin, this 600-page book that is very easy reading and is notably good science. I'm very impressed in reading it because he lays out all the arguments against what he is saying, and that's always the sign of a good scientist. He's coming to grips, not dismissing or ignoring against what he's saying, but laying them out and dealing with them as thoughtfully as he could. Now, of course, at that time, he was crippled compared to today by having far less knowledge, particularly of how variation could happen, what mutations were. I mean, none of this, Mendel's work, it wasn't rediscovered until 40 years, more than 40 years later. So he was working with a huge handicap and couldn't answer some of the questions. But we'll come to that a little bit more in a moment. So the key ideas, really two key ideas in that book, simple ideas. And I'd like to emphasize in this that one issue he didn't really deal with, and I'm not going to deal with, is the origin of life. Evolution is about change from pre-existing forms. It does not address the question of how life started. And it has enough trouble with how life changed. It's a tough problem. Okay, so the two ideas were that there's a tree of life, descent with modification, that species aren't stable. They may be stable for a while, but there's either change or the potential to change going on all the time. And the second, of course, is natural selection. Now, not artificial, not human selection, but forces of nature causing situations where some organisms of a species would have an advantage over others, that the variants that had come up would have different chances of survival depending on how well suited they were to what had happened after the storm had passed, after the hurricane had swept away all the vegetation, after the earthquake had reached the altitude, whatever it was, certain animals would do better than others. Now, within the idea of descent with modification, there is inherent the issue, there has to be growth and reproduction, and the reproduction has to involve some inheritance of form. First of all, to generate variants, and second of all, to preserve some of those variants. There has to be significant variability, and one of the things Darwin couldn't say anything about is how variability happened. But it was obvious from artificial selection and from every farmer's experience that there was all kinds of variability. And indeed, just look around you, all right? Or look at your siblings. How much alike are you? You don't share very much. In your DNA, I can tell you there are about 1 million differences in your DNA between what you got from mom and what you got from dad, even though they're supposed to be more or less the same thing. So there is tremendous variation, and when there's variation and there's competition, somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. And that was the basic idea. Number of generations. A little more about that for our case, okay? Modern humans, based on the fossil record, have lived for some 170,000 years or so, plus or minus 50,000, depending on how much you want to stretch the definition. And that means if you figure 20-year generations, the world has been colonized then in a period of about 8,500 generations, with substantial changes in us during that time, but already starting from a modern human. Now that's dwarfed, of course, by any organism that really knows how to reproduce, right? We're really slow, as much fun as some of it is. And the bacteria, of course, are champions. The bacteria in a lab, really growing under optimal conditions, the cells can divide about every 20 minutes. Bacteria have been found 7 miles down in the ocean, 40 miles up in the atmosphere, and each of you was walking around with 2 or 3 pounds of bacteria in you. That wasn't the dinner. It was already there. It's helping you digest your dinner as we speak. It's amazing, these things, okay? How many are on Earth? About 5 times 10 to the 30th is the estimate, which I can't even conceive of a total weight of 10 to the 12 kilograms of bacteria. So there's as much carbon stored in bacteria as in plants. Huge number of these cells. They're single cells. They're very tough. They live in every possible circumstance. And boy, can they evolve, all right? Because that number of generations, I don't know how many generations it's been. It's some nearly infinite number. And they're all changing a little bit all the time and competing ferociously. You've got the chance to do a lot. Okay, so let me read from the origin briefly here. and then talk about natural selection. So here's some of Darwin's comments on the fact that species are variable and they change, and there's descent with modification. He says, authors of the highest eminence seem to be fully satisfied with the view that each species has been independently, now we're going to select for people who have watertight skins. They warned us about the helicopters. They didn't say anything about the sprinklers. So as I was saying, geologic upheavals, unexpected ones, can create circumstances of selection for speed, for waterproofness, for thinking ahead. All right, so authors of the highest eminence, said Darwin in The Origin of Species, seem to be fully satisfied with the view that each species has been independently created. To my mind, it accords better with what we know of the laws impressed on matter by the Creator, that the production and extinction of the past and present inhabitants of the world should have been due to secondary causes, like those determining the birth and death of the individual. When I view all beings not as special creations, but as the lineal descendants of some few beings which lived long before the first bed of the Cambrian system was deposited, they seem to me to become ennobled. Judging from the past, we may safely infer that not one living species will transmit its unaltered likeness to a distant futurity. That's exactly right. Nothing is copied exactly. And of the species now living, very few will transmit progeny of any kind to a far distant futurity, for the manner in which all organic beings are grouped shows that the greater number of species in each genus, and all the species in many genera, have left no descendants, but have become utterly extinct. So all his experience, the experience of many others with fossils, showed vast numbers of animals that didn't make it. There goes another one. Uh-oh. Ah, yes. You know, usually at famous technical universities and stuff, you find none of the projectors work and so on. Here, I thought the worst that could happen is I'd lose the mic, you know, but okay, I'll try. Here we go. So, all right. So natural selection, the ratio of increase, meaning the number of individuals who are born in one way or another, is always too many for the number that can actually go on to survive. And this is the key starting point, because if somebody's going to reproduce, there's a competition. There is a natural selection of variants that survive better and extinction of less improved forms, except temporarily or in situations where we're putting on eyeglasses or whatever. Now, one of the hardest things to grasp is that a very small difference can confer in nature a very large advantage. A 1% advantage over others in a population quickly, meaning in some hundreds of generations, spreads through the population and takes over the population. Now that's talking about one trait, and I want to emphasize here that what's changing in animals, in us, in plants, is not one thing at a time. It's all sorts of things are changing. Every attribute is changing all the time. And most of those things are either innocuous or harmful or whatever, but once in a while there's a slight improvement somewhere, and that will quickly sweep through a population. Now we see these differences, the oddities, celebrated in dogs and cats, in corn and whatever, where the oddities have been carefully preserved when they turned out to be useful. We see it in the famous legend of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, which some of you will recall was looked on as kind of a lesser deer until he was needed to guide Santa's sleigh, in which case he was very useful. In my lawn, unlike this highly groomed one where there's a decent level of weeds, we have weeds that have learned in some sense to stay low because there are these lawnmowers that come by. And if they want to flower, They got to keep low. So there's a very rapid selection for this sort of thing. Giraffes, presumably the tallest ones could reach food, the shorter ones couldn't reach. There's a selection for taller ones. If in the Masai Mara Preserve in Kenya someone established a helicopter port, there might be a reverse selection process that would start up, who knows. So the point is, variation is all around us, very familiar, and it's no mystery how this works for these familiar cases. When you look at the full wealth and complexity of the natural world, it's dizzying. Anyone who's walked through a piece of the Amazon or a cloud forest or looked at a coral reef, it's completely overwhelming. Why are so many forms there? No one knows really why those fish are so beautifully colored on a coral reef. It's really not clear. So there are many mysteries that aren't answered, and these mysteries are usually the source of attacks on the whole idea. And the idea seems clearly right, but we can't come close to explaining everything we see yet. There's lots of room there for more exploration and more people to take off at age 22 and start doing something really rebellious. So what acts upon the natural selection? Changing conditions, weather, climate, volcanoes, earthquakes, continental drift, which is another thing, of course, Darwin didn't know to work with, sea level, meteors blackening the sky or volcanoes blackening the sky, migration of organisms. We have huge problems in California with foreign organisms sweeping through our landscape, including on this campus, and invasive species, predators come in. The whole picture, a stable ecosystem, is drastically changed by a dandelion, a Japanese beetle, or what have you, right? Okay, so many obvious changes. The drama of these changes is captured in another way by one simple sentence, which is the summit of Mount Everest is composed of seabed sediments. That takes it home for me. Okay, now, what about some evidence? Because of course, as Darwin proposed this, everybody started, leaping to say this is hogwash and so on and so forth. The fossil record is far less dramatic then than it is now, although there was a lot of good work. What we've learned now from the fossil record are, four very important points. One is that the time span is very long. One is that the climate and conditions in any given area have changed drastically. Another is that animals and plants have changed over time. And a fourth is that most species that ever existed are extinct. Okay, those are things we've learned. And you can see examples of all of those properties at some of the best known sites to go see amazing things in this country, this continent. The Burgess Shale in British Columbia, 500 million year old collection of really strange animals, many of which don't exist anymore. Dinosaur National Monument, 150 million years ago, the original Jurassic Park. And right in the middle of Los Angeles, the La Brea tar pits for 12 or 14,000 years ago, saber-toothed cats, mastodons, dire wolves, all the things that Hollywood needed right there in the middle of the city, stuck in the tar pits, okay? Now, Darwin's comment about the controversy about missing links, because of course, in the early days especially, it was easy to attack the whole thing by just saying, well, where are all the intermediate forms between all these different creatures? Darwin said, there must have been 1,000 forms between an otter and its land ancestor. Opponents will say, show me them. I will answer yes if you will show me every step between bulldog and greyhound. It's just hard to keep track, right? You don't have all the records, you don't have all the fossils, and some of the things that were intermediate were very quickly overwhelmed by something that was better, is the idea. Now, happily for Darwin, just 2 years after he published The Origin, Archaeopteryx was found. And then more cases of it were found. This is the famous flying reptile that was the first, 150 million years old, first really clear evidence for the relation between dinosaurs and birds. They didn't have the feathers at that point. That came later, much later, quite recently, in fact. But as you probably know, and you've heard, because it's pretty dramatic, there are now very clear fossils showing that even a relative of Tyrannosaurus rex, a small relative only 5 feet high, makes a great pet, had feathers. And these things, and probably, there's no evidence against it, Tyrannosaurus may have had feathers, which is almost embarrassing, but there it is. So there's incredible finds in China mostly by a man named Zhu Jing, but very well accepted finds have shown a variety of feathered carnivorous dinosaurs, one of which may have flown. It's a small one, and it has feathers on all four limbs that look like flight feathers, very strange thing. And another one that clearly did not fly and presumably had feathers to keep warm, which is what I do when I wear my down parka. Now, at about the same time these things were being found, somebody reported that baby partridges flap their wings to run uphill. And you think about that, that's one of those cute little things you notice, and then you go, whoa, this has a really interesting idea in it, which is why have feathers, why have wings if you can't fly? Well, there's a reason. Okay, so there have been, in fact, numerous missing link kinds of fossils found in the transition from hoofed animals to whales, for example. Whales are now thought to have evolved perhaps from hippos, that's still controversial, or a shared ancestor with hippos, but certainly from the family of hoofed animals, giraffes, camels, cows, pigs, all those things. Whales are in there, and that was first suggested by DNA similarities and later supported with fossil whales that have hooves. Hard to deal with, and of course 4 legs. All right, so there are many examples now of these transitional forms, and the old arguments, the initial arguments against Darwin, which were you haven't shown us anything like this, have really been largely overcome, I think, by these things. Now, the other big problem he had was with time. And this problem was made much worse because he knew he needed a lot of time. And it was made much worse because of the most famous physicist of the time, chemist physicist Lord Kelvin, who thought he was all wrong and thought the Earth, based on very sensible and careful calculations, could not be more than 100 million years old. He modeled the decay of the Earth's heat and figured out how old it might be. And Darwin, to his credit, felt that 100 million wasn't enough. Other people tried to brush it off and say, it's plenty. Evolution used to go faster, But it wasn't plenty. And the key assumption that turned out to be wrong is that the amount of heat in the Earth was all there was, and there wasn't any more coming from anywhere. It was a continuous cooling with no regeneration of heat. And that was wrong because of radioactivity. But Kelvin's calculation was entirely reasonable. Actually, the number kept shrinking as he redid the calculation down to 20 million at one point. And that was really getting Darwin upset. But eventually, not in time for Darwin, it became clear that new heat was being generated by radioactive decay. Now, Kelvin, who was a crusty, very eminent, very famous guy, was informed of this when Ernest Rutherford, who'd been working at this at McGill University, came in 1904 to England to give a lecture. And he was nervous about this. And here's what Rutherford wrote about the experience. I came into the room, which was half dark, and presently spotted Lord Kelvin in the audience and realized that I was in for trouble at the last part of the speech, where my views conflicted with his. To my relief, Kelvin fell fast asleep. But as I came to the important point, I saw the old bird sit up, open an eye, and cock a baleful glance at me. Then a sudden inspiration came, and I said, Lord Kelvin had limited the age of the Earth, provided no new source of heat was discovered. That prophetic utterance refers to what we are now considering tonight, radium. Behold, the old boy beamed upon me. That's what he said. So that was kind of fun. Now, from a somewhat unexpected source, you get more commentary about this whole situation. And that was Mark Twain, 1903. He made several comments on the situation. I'm going to read this. It's a little long, but I cut out a lot. So Mark Twain says, I seem to be the only scientist and theologian still remaining to be heard from on this oh, no. It takes a long time to prepare a world for man. Such a thing is not done in a day. Some of the great scientists, carefully ciphering the evidences furnished by geology, have arrived at the conviction that our world is prodigiously old, and they may be right, but Lord Kelvin is not of their opinion. He takes a cautious conservative view in order to be on the safe side and feels sure it is not so old as they think. As Lord Kelvin is the highest authority in science now living, I think we must yield to him and accept his view. He does not concede that the world is older than 100 million years. He believes it is that old, not older. Lyell believed that our race was introduced into the world 31,000 years ago. Herbert Spencer makes it 32,000. Lord Kelvin agrees with Spencer. Very well. According to these figures, it took 99,968,000 years to prepare the world for man, impatient as the Creator doubtless was to see him and admire him. But a large enterprise like this has to be conducted warily, painstakingly, logically. It was foreseen that man would have to have the oyster. Therefore, the first preparation was made for the oyster. This was not done in a day. You must make a vast variety of invertebrates to start with and put them to soak in a primeval sea and wait and see what will happen. Some will be a disappointment. The ammonites and such, they will be covered. They will die out and become extinct in the course of the 19 million years of the experiment. An oyster has hardly any more reasoning power than a scientist has, and so it is reasonably certain that this one jumped to the conclusion that the 19 million years was a preparation for him. But that would be just like an oyster, which is the most conceited animal there is, except man. And anyway, this one could not know at that early date that he was only an incident in the scheme, and that there was more to the scheme yet. And of course, Twain is talking about our views of ourselves as the culmination. So then he goes through fish and reptiles and monkeys, all of which I'll spare you, and then finishes with man has been here 32,000 years. That, by the way, was not that far off. I said modern humans 172,000 or so estimated. That it took 100 million years to prepare for him is proof that that is what it was done for. I suppose it is, I don't know. If the Eiffel Tower were now representing the world's age, the skin of paint on the pinnacle knob at its summit would represent man's share of that age. And anybody would perceive that that skin was what the tower was built for. I reckon they would. I don't know. So that's what he thought. Okay, so we're going to look at time, because time is, where are my able assistants here? Time is something that big numbers are hard for me to deal with. But I don't think I'm alone. And our present view of time helps us in thinking about how long all this stuff went on, all these changes and all this planning or whatever. Okay, so we have a ribbon here that represents the age of the Earth, which is presently estimated at 4.55 billion years, and that's where we start. Go that way, watch out for sprinklers. Okay, and so we're going to sort of read off what happens at different times. 4.4 billion years ago, water condenses into oceans, so that's good. So now you have somewhere to swim to start life with. But it's quite a while. We don't know what happened here. This is a measure of our ignorance, a pretty long measure of our ignorance. Still ignorant. Okay, whoops, something happened. 3.8 billion years ago, earliest chemical evidence of life, molecules found in rocks that probably could only come from living cells producing them, but no direct evidence of the cells. Whoops, slow down. 3.5 billion years ago, the earliest fossils, which looked like cyanobacteria. Onward. It's going to be a while. Now, these things are swimming around, evolving, and trying to be much better than they started out, and they have lots of time to do it. I may need another girl soon. All right, hold it. 2.7 billion years, so we just went through 800 million years. Earliest chemical evidence for eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are the kinds of cells that we're made of, and one of the most distinctive things they have is cholesterol. Bad stuff, but useful for noticing eukaryotes. So there was some cholesterol here, so maybe there were some eukaryotes. Keep going. Whoops, something else. 2.6 billion years ago, bacteria living on the land. So that's a change from swimming all the time. Okay. And then lots of time for them to think about what living on the land meant. Find the best restaurants. Okay. And, hold it. 1.8 billion years ago, the oldest multicellular fossils. Okay. Keep going. We'll get to the election soon. Stop. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Oldest eukaryotic fossils. So that's the first sign of complicated cells like us, and we're talking about 1 billion years ago. All right. Onward. Slow down. This is the Precambrian up to here. Precambrian is longer than. We've got some the water condensing into the oceans of the Precambrian. Had the end of the earth here. All right. Here, I'll do this. There's all sorts of good things happen in there. This little lavalier mic is not working as far as I can tell. All right, so I have to stand. Come back here, Julia. Come this way. Because we've got all sorts of things to discuss that we missed. And I have to stand in front of this mic or I'll fall off the earth. Okay, so 575 million years ago, the oldest animal fossils, some really weird looking things called ediacarans. 550 million years ago, we start the Cambrian era. 535 million years ago is the so-called Cambrian explosion. And this is the time, narrowed to a 10 million year period, when there was, please don't pull, come back here, the earth is going to fall apart. 10 million period when there was an explosion of different animal forms, very complex animals with left-right asymmetry and symmetry in some cases, and repeating body segments and all sorts of really fancy stuff here. And then plants on land by 500 million years. By 450 million years, insects and other invertebrates on land. Don't pull. The Devonian era, 360 million years ago, four-limbed vertebrates on the land and trees on the land, 60 feet high. 320 million years ago, the first amphibians. 225 million years ago, the start of the mammals and the dinosaurs and great movies. Started Jurassic at 200 million years ago, the first flowering plants there, don't pull. The end of the Jurassic 150 million years ago, then the Cretaceous. I haven't shown all the different epochs and eras and mistakes and so on. Whoops. Don't pull. Come back here. All right. So a couple of good things happen here at the end. All right. Dinosaurs go extinct here 65 million years ago, most of them. 60 million years is when we had a common ancestor with mice and humans. Those who have been to Grand Teton National Park will be interested to know that those mountains were built here long after the mice and humans got different. Humans and chimps separated here 5 million years ago. The modern humans are a little black stripe here at the end that was supposed to be 0.03 of an inch wide, but I couldn't draw that. Okay. So that's the Earth history, and this is what we're dealing with. And as you can see, there was quite a lot of time to mess around with different creatures. Okay, you go to another solar system, and we'll continue over here. All right. Good. Thank you. They were great, weren't they? Yeah. Okay. So what I'm going to, yeah, you can use that, sure. Okay, so with our interruptions and here, another one, here we go. It's sort of unbelievable. They aren't even, they're staggered, so they really sneak up on you. They don't even go continuously. They lull you into this false sense of security and then wham. Oh boy. Okay, so it's a little hard to get serious in the midst of this. Maybe I should give up. But I was supposed to tell you about disease and human development and genes and stuff. We're going a little late here. I'll try to make it fast, okay? Despite the interruptions. All right. So the biggest problem that Darwin really had nothing, he thought a lot about embryology, but he didn't have the working knowledge of genetics and of developmental biology, and especially since Mendel for genetics, and especially in the past 20, 25 years for developmental biology, there has been an enormous increase in the understanding of what genes control development and how those genes contribute to disease. Now, we're talking about, for animals and for things I'm discussing now, this last 500 million years, because it's clear already in the sort of Cambrian, Precambrian, Cambrian transition and the Cambrian explosion, there was a time when there were a lot of complicated animals, and those animals had a lot of the features of modern day animals, though certainly not all of them. So I have to tell you a little bit about genetics. You can notice my lavish illustrations, stare at the moon, pretend I had slides here to explain this more clearly. This is really hard, I'd like to say. Okay, so each cell in your body, which is maybe 10 millionths of a meter across or something, has 2 meters of DNA in it. A long piece of bunch of pieces of DNA. Each chromosome is a separate piece, but they add up to about 2 meters. You have about 100 trillion cells. A cell can copy itself in less than a day, copying all of that DNA nearly perfectly. It's amazing what goes on in little spaces. You have about 3 billion little subunits of that DNA in 4 flavors called A, C, T, and G. And those 4 flavors, those 4 subunits, are in a certain order, and that is the genetic code, and that's what carries the information to make you what you are in an interaction process, of course, with the environment. All right, so that's the code. And when we do genome projects, we're figuring out the order of those A's, C's, T's, and G's, and building up, in essence, a phone book that shows which sequences of those things are at which places in your chromosomes. Now, all of you started from a single cell that's only 200 millionths of a meter across, and that single cell had these chromosomes in it, one set inherited from your mother, one from your father, and that cell has in it enough information to build a human, which is absolutely inconceivable. And think of how Darwin had to struggle with this problem. And now, of course, we have some idea of the complexity of the code, and it's no longer quite so inconceivable. So what is changing then in evolution is the code. And you need to have some idea to really understand evolution of what, in fact, is changing. So we can say the DNA is changing, but what in it? Okay, what about the number of genes? A gene is a stretch of DNA that might be some thousands of these A's, C's, T's, and G's in a certain order. Each such gene codes for one kind of protein, oversimplifying a little bit, and you can count the number of genes. Now, you may have followed in the press this amusing process, because everybody started out with this bias that humans, being so fabulous, must have far more genes than anybody else. There are awkwardly salamanders with 10 times as much DNA as we have, but don't worry about the salamanders. Maybe they're just weird, or they're collectors or something. But the number of genes was first estimated at 100,000. You probably followed this in the papers. And then it was 50 and 30, and now it's 25. And if it keeps going, we won't have any genes at all, in fact. Worms have about 18,000. Flies have about 13,000. It's not how many, it's how they're used, right, to build interesting things. And in fact, genes are controlled so that they're activated at certain times and places. And since there is this basic, probably 500 million year old working toolkit that has pretty much all the genes in it, what's changed is how they're deployed. And a given tool out of the toolkit, a given gene or protein or whatever, will be used over and over again during your lifetime in different tissues and for different purposes and so on. So there's the potential for a gene to be used much more than it was in its first application, as it were, a long time ago. Okay, so each gene encodes a protein. There are thousands of different kinds of proteins. We can recognize what they do in many cases by looking at what they are like. And proteins do all sorts of things. They're building blocks for cells. They're bricks and mortar. They are enzymes that do things like digest other molecules and do chemical processing. And they are regulators. For instance, certain proteins will stick very specifically to the DNA near a certain gene, and turn on or off the activity of that gene, because all your cells have the same genes in them, but in one type of cell you'll have a bunch, a set of genes active and all the other ones will be inactive in that cell, and in a different type of cell you'll have a different set of genes active. So for example, the gene in your red blood cells that used to be in your red blood cells called the hemoglobin gene makes a protein that carries oxygen, and you don't need to carry oxygen in your skin cells or something. So you don't make that hemoglobin protein in your skin cells. So the hemoglobin gene is off in your skin cells, on in your blood cells, and so on. And this is true for thousands of genes. And the way they're turned on and off is by proteins landing on the gene and causing it to be off or causing it to be on. And a lot of people are studying disease processes now by looking at which genes are on or off in the course of a disease. And sometimes it's the wrong genes and so on. Okay, so how much variation is there? How much variation is there in the genes? So I mentioned earlier that between any two humans there's about a 1 in 1,000 variation in these A's, C's, T's, and G's. So you get one copy of chromosomes from mom, one from dad, and about 1 in 1,000 of the things will be different. Okay, so there's lots of variation there already, millions of differences already just in you. There's a sort of reservoir of variation sitting there. What about us versus chimps? Well, people always quote the figure, which we now know as an accurate figure because we have the genome project done for the chimp, that we're 99% identical in our DNA to a chimp. Our closest ancestor, 5 million years, 99% identical. Well, I know from having visited with chimps that I'm not 99% identical, I'm sorry, but my DNA is. And so then the question is, what's the difference? Well, there are 30 million differences in the 1%. And most of them may be utterly unimportant for the differences between us and chimps, but somewhere in there, there are some very, very interesting and very important differences that shape our bodies. So you'd like to set out then to find the genes that participate in building the most interesting parts of the bodies, the muscles, the bones, the brains, all these organs and so on. You've got to find those genes, and it's really hard to do that. You have 25,000 genes in you. You don't know what they're doing. Where do you start? So the answer is that developmental biologists and geneticists have now for a couple of decades been working with other animals like fruit flies and worms and things to find all the genes that control their growth and organ formation and development. And it's led to an astonishing revelation that shouldn't be, but was, because nobody predicted what happened. As we started to find out all the genes that governed development in these other organisms, it became clear that not only were those genes being found for those organisms, but the same kinds of genes, the same kinds of proteins were at work in humans for the same kinds of process. Even though we're separated by 500 million years of evolution from the ancestors of insects, for example, that Cambrian period, we're still sharing certain genes. So the genes that organize your body from your head to your tail are doing that in us, doing that in insects, doing that in worms, and so on. And the genes that help to build the eye are doing that in us and doing it in insects, even though the eyes look utterly different. The genes that build a heart are to some extent shared between us and insects. Now, this is something that goes part way. It's not the whole thing. In other words, it's not all the same genes work to build our hearts that build insects' hearts, but it's enough of a guide that it gives you a huge head start in the problem of finding the human genes that matter. And indeed, a gene, this has to stop. Can you? Sorry, it's too distracting. I hear those heart genes calling me. So if you take, for example, the gene that was discovered in fruit flies called Tin Man, it was named, all Wizard of Oz fans will know, that gene has, mutations of that gene cause the flies to develop with no hearts. Tin Man, right. So you look at the human Tin Man gene, and people who lack one of their 2 normal copies of that gene, so they've got half the usual dose of that gene, those people have a whole series of heart defects. Okay, so you discover the gene in flies, you go right to human heart disease as a result of that discovery. So that's very, very useful. It's practical information. Now, in our work, as Channing mentioned about 8 hours ago when I began, we study this signaling system called hedgehog signaling. And hedgehog was named, as he mentioned, because the fly mutants are really bristly, more so than normal. And this whole system of signaling has been worked out in flies and other organisms. Certain cells secrete a protein, which is named the hedgehog protein. That protein travels across some tissue, binds to some receptors on the surface of other cells, and then there's a whole set of switches and communicators within those cells that say the signal's arrived and sort of control the cell, change what the cell is doing. They can cause the cell to grow, or they cause the cell to do something different than it was doing before. So that kind of signaling process, which is very common in development, that acts over a certain range, was all worked out in flies and somewhat other organisms, and all of it turned out to be transferable to humans. And when we followed one of the genes in that set of genes that's involved in that signaling system to humans, it mapped to a place on a human chromosome that where it was already known that there was an inherited disease mapped called Gorlin syndrome, a rare disease, which involves birth defects and a propensity to develop certain types of cancer, brain cancer and skin cancer. We then proved that it was indeed our favorite gene that was getting damaged in those families that inherited this disease. And then found also that when those cancers happen without the inherited disease, just happen due, for instance, to sunlight hitting the skin, that the same gene was getting damaged. Now, if you have a system of switches with 10 components and you find out that one of them damaged causes cancer, it's no great leap to say, well, maybe some of the other parts of the system also cause cancer. And indeed, that logic was used in this case by other labs to look and find out that 2 of the other 3 now of the other components of the system are also human cancer genes. So this is tracing genetic causes of cancer. What genes are getting damaged by ultraviolet radiation, for example, to cause skin cancer. But it goes beyond this because it also leads you toward therapies. Because now you have a set of components of a signaling pathway that's used in normal development, but is also used to control growth. And when it's not properly restrained, there is cancer. So now you can say, okay, I'm going to find a drug that will inhibit this particular protein I've identified. And actually, I have 9 others I might try as well as drug targets, as things I'd like to inhibit to prevent the growth of these cancers. And there is some very promising work going on right now pursuing possible therapies for this basal cell carcinoma of the skin, which is caused by damage to this pathway, and medulloblastoma, the most common childhood malignant brain tumor, which is sometimes caused by damage to this hedgehog signaling system. Now, our experience, and this is a whole group of labs in this field, is typical of a larger experience that many labs with many signaling systems are discovering. Many of these developmental genes, as you'd expect, if they get damaged, you get birth defects, cancer, degenerative disease, and so on. So by studying these things in relatively simpler animals, although animals that can fly and do things we can't even dream of, if you study these things in these other systems, a lot of it, not all of it, transfers in a useful way to human medicine. So that's one way in which evolution, that is the persistence of dedicated proteins and genes to a certain process, is guiding medicine. There are 2 other very important ways. One is cancer itself. Cancer is evolution as a microcosm. Cancer cells, when they first start to grow out of control, aren't very dangerous. They usually start off, they're sort of growing a little too fast, but not real fast, and they can't break loose and metastasize to new places. They can't penetrate tissue, and they don't have any blood supply. So they can't grow very much without a blood supply because they need oxygen. But what happens is the cells, you get a little lump of cells. Now you've got lots of cells, and if any of those gets mutated some more, changed some more. Maybe one of those cells is going to acquire some characteristic, like it starts sending out a signal, which they do, to call for the growth of blood vessels, or the cell loses its attachment and starts to be able to move through the bloodstream and grows, and now those cells will mutate still further and acquire more and more nasty characteristics, because remember, the selection here, the survival selection, is the worst possible one. The cells that succeed in growing are the cells that will continue to produce more cells. The worst cells get rewarded. So cancer itself is an evolutionary process in this sense. The other big medical impact of evolution, and I have more material than I will even think about talking about tonight, but in infectious disease, oh boy, there's another one. It's amazing. We thought we'd beaten it. Okay. In infectious disease with trillions of microorganisms growing, there is, of course, a selection under situations of drug treatment where the worst infectious organisms are the ones that are surviving. So the huge increase in multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis bacteria, particularly in Russian prisons, is a terrifying prospect at this point. The rate of infection around the world is huge. Some 7% or so of those are multiply drug-resistant. And the more antibiotics are misused, the more there is a strong selection imposed for bugs, superbugs, that are resistant to 1, 2, 3, or 4 different antibiotics. So this is evolution in action. AIDS gives us 2 examples of evolution in action. One is a very rapidly mutating virus that in fact is designed to mutate rapidly. It deliberately makes lots of mistakes and changes itself faster than metamorphosis. It's an amazing thing. But there's sort of good news on the other side too, in that a variant protein, that when the virus infects, it sticks to proteins on the surface of cells, and those proteins are known. And there have been discoveries about people who have variant proteins that prevent infection. Now, that doesn't help all the people who don't have those variant proteins directly, but it does give an idea right off about what might be targeted. If you were to interfere with the sticking of the virus to that protein, maybe you could protect people from infection. So coming from an evolutionary sort of logic, this looks pretty good. Okay, so you've been enormously patient with adversity you never dreamed of. I'm going to end just by summarizing a few points that I hope penetrated the sprinkler systems and everything else, and then I'll be happy to stick around and try to answer any questions. So first of all, obviously, evolution is the central underpinning for all of modern biology and for a lot of issues in medicine. It's change in organisms over time. It's been vastly documented at the molecular and the morphological levels. It can happen due to artificial selection that we do to change organisms the way we want, and to natural selection. It can also happen inadvertently due to things we do, and the vast destruction of species that's in progress right now as a result of human interference is something that's really very sad. And while there will, of course, be evolutionary adaptation to this vast extinction that's going on, it's a very, very slow process and will not benefit our progeny, our immediate progeny. So it's worth thinking about it that way. Evolution is the source of much beauty. The vast diversity of animals and plants that we all enjoy so much is a product of species trying to find a way to survive by being different from the others of their own ilk. And on the negative side, evolution is how disease organisms prosper in the face of partial antibiotic treatments, or how cancer cells evolve, mutate, and change in your body to become more dangerous. So these are many different sides of evolution, some happy, some sad, and the more we can understand about how the process works, the better we'll be able to maximize the happy and minimize the sad. So I'll end with a little quote from Charles, who we left stranded in England with 10 children and lots of dogs. He ends the origin with this paragraph. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. And that's where we'll stop.
Thank you, Matt. I have to confess, the sprinklers were intended. This was an experiment in survival of the fittest. And you notice a large extinction occurred up here on the right. And you are the survivors. I've never seen anybody, I've been in this business for 40 years. First of all, we told them to give a talk with no visuals. Then we had airplanes go over, we had sprinklers turn on, and now we're going to bring in a Korean missile. So I have 2 microphones, so here's the game. If you have a question, raise your hand, and I'll give you the microphone, and you can ask the question, and then I'll hand it to whoever else has their hand up. If you don't have a microphone, don't ask, because no one's going to hear you anyway. Okay, so we'll start.
I'm trying to learn the basics of biology and astronomy and so forth. When I read the word nature, I'm not able to perceive. Could you give us a simple description of the word nature and also the word Darwin used as a creator?
Yes, you can have some water. The question, which I had a little bit trouble hearing, but was definition of nature and comment on Darwin's use of the word creator. Darwin came very close to being a minister, and he was basically, adventurous and ended up going on this voyage, and it changed his life. But had he not, it would have been the ministry for him. He was a very religious man, and his wife was even more so. And he was troubled during most of his life thinking about all these ideas about how to reconcile his religion and his scientific observations. And I think the basic answer is he never fully did. Now, many people feel there is no real conflict between this science and their religion. The Pope, for example, has said that, evolution seems to be well established. There are 2 different realms. It's very tricky to think about how to reconcile things, except one can always say that whatever is happening, that God set it up. The Creator set up what is happening and is watching it happen and controlling it, what is happening, if one wants to think about it that way. Most major religions don't see this as a conflict with beliefs in religion, but obviously there are some outspoken groups that do. I think it is very hard to deal with the idea that the Earth is started in 4004 BC, which is what Bishop Ussher calculated at one point. And so there are things here that just seem as though they should be in the religious heritage, that seem as though they should be taken metaphorically rather than literally. For nature is, for me, simply a word that encompasses all that is living, and that means plants and animals, and that's all it means to me. And it's used, I think, in all sorts of different ways by different people, but that's what I think.
In all the arguments given by the creationists and intelligent design advocates, are there any that are interesting to respond to? Anything that actually has some content that takes a little work to respond to?
Yes. I mean, the arguments about this keep retreating in a way as more first it was you don't have any intermediate fossils, and that's long over, and so on. But the most interesting current one probably is cases where there are multiple pieces of a working system, and it's hard to imagine any one of them having any purpose in the absence of the others. And there are a number of examples of this, the bacterial flagellum, which is sort of a swiveling motor, and so on. But there are so many counterexamples now where it's clear where the pieces came from, that they had a different purpose in a cell or in an organ or a tissue, and then they were adapted to a new purpose in concert with some other piece that came along. If we look at the lens of the eye, which is made of protein, and you look in different animals, different proteins are used in different animals. All they have to do is crystallize and be transparent. As long as it works, it works. But you can look at where these proteins came from, and they're at least some of them are proteins that are absolutely well known for completely different purposes in the cell. And since they happen to crystallize into nice transparent blobs, somewhere along the line they sort of got co-opted for that purpose. But there are many things still to be worked out, I'd say, about how some of the machines we see in biology, the mitotic spindle on which the chromosomes assemble and then sort themselves out and separate, so each daughter cell has a perfect set. There's an enormous amount known about that already. There are all sorts of fail-safe mechanisms and checkpoints and so on, but it's still an amazing machine, and it's very hard to go back into billion-year-old history and figure out how that machine first came to be. And of course, still harder to think about the origin of life and how all of this might have emerged from primordial goo. So I think there's a lot to be done. The thing is, if you look at the history of biology, there were inconceivable the solutions to problems were inconceivable again and again and again in the past, and again they've been overcome. So there's no sign right now of anything that looks even remotely insurmountable.
Could you tell us briefly what was necessary for the discovery of the gene? How was the existence of a gene discovered?
Yeah, it's a good question. How was the existence of a gene discovered? It used to be thought that things kind of mushed together and there was inheritance, but it was sort of a vague blending and so on. And they're really, the first key point about a gene is that it had a location. It behaved as though it had a location, and it would be an inherited unit. And at the time it was discovered, nobody knew anything about DNA or anything, but you could follow the gene as a discrete entity. It was inherited through a series of generations. So Mendel did that with pea plants, and the peas had round or wrinkled shapes and different colors and so on. And he could show the inheritance of some controlling entity that behaved in a predictable fashion through multiple generations. And as genetic techniques improved, it was possible to map that controlling entity to a particular chromosome and even to a particular part of a chromosome. So now there was something that was still mysterious. This is one of genetics is the most wonderful, intellectually elegant sort of science, because you can infer the existence of things you can't see yet. So nobody had any way to see a gene or anything, but you knew where it was located. And eventually, as recombinant DNA was invented, you could go in there and pull out the piece of DNA at that location and show that it coded for a protein that did indeed control the color of the pea or the wrinkling or the smooth and so on. So it started out as a discrete entity that was inherited in a certain pattern, then it was mapped to a location, and then it was physically isolated and analyzed. Does that help with your question? Okay.
So there's this book, Acquiring Genomes, by Lynn Margulis, the biology professor at University of Amherst, and Carl Sagan's wife.
Yeah.
And so the whole book describes is evidence for genomes being sort of included as ways of getting major speciation changes. What's the current thinking in the community about that idea?
Okay, so there are we've talked about DNA being passed down, from generation to generation, gradually changing, a small number of variations at each generation. In bacteria, there is lateral transfer of DNA. They're passing information around, and to some extent in other organisms. But in bacteria, it looks like it's really prevalent. This is the way, for example, that antibiotic resistance in bacteria spreads so fast, because they have little pieces of DNA in them that encode the proteins to make them resistant to antibiotics. And they release some of that DNA, and other bacteria slurp it up. And if they do that, they become resistant. And even if it's a very rare event, and only 1 in a billion bacteria does it, that's plenty, because that one is going to grow up very quickly to be a billion. So there's transfer of DNA that way. Then there can be other kinds of changes. For example, the mitochondria, which are the little powerhouses of eukaryotic cells. They make the ATP, the chemical energy that powers the cell, burning sugar to do it. Those mitochondria, oh boy, looks like we're pretty well covered, though. We're beginning to win. By tomorrow morning, we should have this set. You're brave. Thanks. Mitochondria were ancestrally bacteria, and they, in fact, even have their own little genome. So they've been picked up by eukaryotic cells, and plants have chloroplasts, which are similar things that used to be bacteria that help turn light into energy, and they've been picked up. So there are all these interesting cases of transfer of DNA by other than the typical inheritance pattern. For more complex animals like us, it's hard to tell how much of this sort of stuff has really gone on. You know, do we ever get DNA from something we ate? So far, the genome projects argue pretty strongly against that, but it's certainly not ruled out at this point. Does that help them? So the question is whether cancer could be looked at as some sort of symbiotic process rather than a parasitic process. In terms of any evolutionary benefit to an organism or a species or something, it has to take effect before reproductive age to have any impact, because once reproduction is over, then whatever is passed on is passed on, so it's not going to affect that. And so many cancers are, in fact, in the category of being, at best, having an indirect effect on the probability of survival. For example, a grandparent could be extremely important to a family situation, and even though the genes are already passed on, they're still going to have an effect on the survival of the children and so on. So a grandparent affected by cancer then could be badly impacted in terms of the survival rate of that family. In terms of the actual properties of the cells inside someone, there's very little evidence for any benefit, and there's a lot of evidence for harm. So the cells are becoming a different organism genetically because they are mutating and they are changing. And I think that probably means, more parasite and less anything else. Does that answer your question? Yeah, cancer seems to be largely, something that occurs as a result of the breakdown of normal control systems. And it doesn't, in any case I can think of offhand, confer much of an advantage to the host. Yeah, so in case somebody didn't hear that, the question is whether our success in treating disease or preventing disease has distorted the evolutionary process and survival of the fittest. Well, I think earlier I gave the example of the eyeglasses, where people are doing fine who in a situation where keen eyesight was really important would be having a very tough time, including me. So I think people are living longer. People are reproductive for a longer period. So there is definitely a different type of evolution going on. In addition, our cultural inheritance, as opposed to our genetic inheritance, is in many areas overwhelming to some degree, the genetic inheritance. So we pass on all sorts of things that are not really in the genes. And so we really are in a separate category to a certain extent now. However, we're still subject to the issues of competition for food and light and air and land and everything else. And obviously traveling around the world is, I think probably everyone here does, and You see the effects of immense human competition and struggles for survival in many areas, and unlike here. So I think we're still heavily immersed in this. The diseases are far from conquered. We've had a temporary advantage over infectious disease with good antibiotics. There are very few new antibiotics, and there better be some soon, because the arms race that goes on, evolutionary arms race between us and our parasites, is not one that we are clearly winning, certainly if you look around the world. There are 42 million people infected with AIDS right now, with HIV right now, for example, and 1 million deaths a year from malaria. So I think, as you're implying, there are cases where we've had an effect on the sort of harshness, in a way, of the survival struggles, but there are other areas where we're losing.
Well, we're rapidly approaching extinction. We have one last question, and then if you still have some burning questions, Matt
Ask Channing.
has a new series called Matt at Sunrise, and we'll just keep this going, so go ahead.
Why are chihuahuas a dead end?
I'm sorry?
You're going to tell us why
I
chihuahuas
didn't.
were
Somebody
dead
else
end.
said that.
Who said chihuahuas are genetic
He said
dead ends?
that.
Oh,
No.
you said it. Ah.
No, he did. I don't know anything about chihuahuas.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you all for
All right,
sticking this out.
thanks. You're
We'll
really
see
an
you in 2
impressively
weeks.
tough group.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.